They called it the deal nobody remembers. But if you follow the trail of money, those invisible rivers that shape every war, every boom, every collapse, you eventually land in 1936 in a quiet conference room where the world's most powerful nations rewrote the financial rules of the modern age. There were no headlines, no crowds, just signatures and a handshake that would shape 80 years of global dominance. This is the story of how a forgotten currency pact between Britain, France, and the United States didn't just stabilize the markets. It cemented the dollar's destiny, turning America's financial system into the gravitational center of the world. And it all started with chaos. In 1931, the gold standard, once considered unbreakable, shattered. For centuries, nations had pegged their currencies to gold, believing a metal could anchor trust. But the Great Depression changed everything. Factories went silent, banks collapsed, tens of millions were unemployed, and politicians across continents were desperate to save their economies from total collapse. Britain moved first. In September 1931, it abandoned gold. Overnight, the pound lost nearly a third of its value. To the world's financial elite, it was unthinkable, a betrayal of centuries of discipline. But for Britain, it was survival. By devaluing the pound, London hoped to make its exports cheaper and help its empire's economy breathe again. Other countries, watching the British gamble, panicked. Some followed their lead. Others doubled down on gold, tightening credit and choking their economies in the name of stability. The result? A currency war. Between 1931 and 1936, nations didn't compete with armies. They competed with exchange rates. It was called beggar thy neighbor economics. Each country tried to devalue its currency faster than the next, hoping to steal growth from others. But what happens when everyone tries to win the same race to the bottom? Everyone loses. The global economy fractured into three camps. The sterling bloc, led by Britain and its colonies. The gold bloc, which included France, Belgium, and Switzerland, clinging desperately to gold. And the dollar bloc, led by the United States, which under Roosevelt was trying something radical, a managed currency tied only loosely to gold. Each bloc distrusted the others. Trade collapsed. Financial flows froze. The same industrial powers that once depended on each other were now financial enemies. Behind the scenes, world leaders were terrified. The instability wasn't just economic, it was political. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler had just risen to power by exploiting that very chaos. In Italy, Mussolini promised economic order. In Japan, the military was expanding into Manchuria, hungry for resources. The West realized that if the democracies didn't fix their economies soon, the extremists would. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt walked into the White House during the worst financial crisis in American history. Banks were failing daily. The stock market had lost nearly 90% of its value. Ordinary Americans were hoarding gold, terrified of the future. Roosevelt made a decision that stunned the world. He confiscated private gold holdings and devalued the dollar. For the first time, the United States government, not the market, would determine the value of its currency. The dollar's peg was changed from about $20 per ounce of gold to $35, instantly devaluing it by nearly 40%. It was a bold, controversial move. It angered bankers and traditional economists. But it worked. By making the dollar cheaper, Roosevelt made American goods more competitive. Factories began to hum again. Confidence started to return. And abroad, something remarkable happened. The world began adjusting to America's new power. Because while Europe fought over who controlled gold, the U.S. had quietly created something far more flexible, a managed government-backed dollar that could bend without breaking. Still, the chaos abroad continued. Britain's pound was unstable. France's franc was under attack. By 1936, Roosevelt's advisors, and their counterparts in Britain and France, knew they needed to end the currency war. They needed a truce. In early September 1936, representatives from the three great Western economies gathered quietly in London. The press was told little. The public was told nothing. Their goal was simple on paper, but revolutionary in practice: to stop manipulating currencies and coordinate exchange rates. The Americans were represented by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. and his brilliant, sharp-tongued assistant, Harry Dexter White. The British sent Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer. France sent its finance minister, Vincent Auriol, under enormous pressure as the franc collapsed. Each man arrived with distrust, but also with desperation. The key question was, who would lead this new financial order? The pound, the franc, or the dollar? The answer was decided not by debate, but by reality. Britain's empire was drowning in debt. France's gold reserves were vanishing. America, by contrast, had more gold than the rest of the world combined, nearly 75% of global reserves. Power follows gold, and gold was now American. On September 25, 1936, the three powers signed what became known as the Tripartite Agreement, a name so dull it disguised its true importance. The Pact committed the U.S., Britain, and France to stabilize their exchange rates. They promised to consult each other before changing currency policies and to intervene in markets together. Most importantly, they recognized the U.S. dollar as the world's central stabilizing force. It wasn't a formal treaty. No parliaments ratified it. It was a gentleman's agreement, written in diplomatic language but backed by iron intent. The impact was immediate. Within months, market volatility dropped. Trade between the blocs began to recover. For the first time in years, the Western economies weren't financial rivals. They were partners. But here's the part no one talks about. While the Tripartite Agreement was sold as a pact among equals, in practice, it cemented the United States as the silent financial leader of the free world. Why? Because the entire arrangement depended on America's gold reserves and its willingness to stabilize the dollar. Britain and France had effectively tied their currencies to U.S. policy. Whenever the pound or franc came under pressure, it was Washington's intervention, not London's or Paris's, that decided their fate. In public, it was framed as cooperation. In reality, it was control through consensus, the art of power disguised as partnership. The Tripartite Agreement created a monetary orbit around the dollar. For the next 3 years, global markets entered a fragile calm. But beneath the surface, new forces were gathering. Germany was rearming. Japan was expanding. The world's attention was drifting from finance to warfare. When the guns roared in 1939, the Tripartite Agreement quietly faded into the background. Yet its architecture, the idea of coordination and stability through the dollar, would re-emerge after the war on a grander scale. Because in 1944, at a little town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, the same ideas and even some of the same men would meet again. Harry Dexter White, the architect of America's position in 1936, would sit across from Britain's John Maynard Keynes. The deal they made there would transform the Tripartite Agreement's quiet principles into a global order, making the dollar the world's official reserve currency. So why does nobody remember the Tripartite Agreement? Because it wasn't dramatic. No movies were made. It was simply the moment when power shifted quietly, from the old European order to the American century. The pound never recovered. The franc became a shadow of its former self. But the dollar, backed by gold, trust, and the U.S. Treasury, became the world's anchor. By 1945, the U.S. wasn't just the arsenal of democracy, it was the banker of the world. And it all began with that quiet 1936 agreement, the moment three nations shook hands and unknowingly handed America the keys to the global economy. In 1936, the world was on a knife's edge. But amidst the rising tensions, three nations, Britain, France, and the United States, made a quiet deal. It wasn't about armies or borders, it was about money. This was the Tripartite Agreement, a pact designed to stop the currency wars that were tearing the global economy apart. And for a brief, shining moment, it worked. The pound, the franc, and the dollar moved in harmony. Phone lines buzzed between London, Paris, and Washington, ensuring no one made a sudden move. For the first time in years, it felt like sanity had returned to the financial world. Newspapers hailed it as a new era of financial cooperation. But this fragile peace was an illusion. While the agreement promised partnership, reality was setting in. France was crippled by political chaos and a bleeding economy. Britain, still clinging to its empire, was losing its industrial edge. Only one nation was truly roaring back to life: the United States. Fueled by New Deal spending, American factories were humming, its economy surging past its European rivals. The so-called cooperation of 1936 had quickly become a relationship of dependency. Britain and France now needed America's gold, its loans, and its industrial might. The stability of their currencies relied entirely on Washington's goodwill. The Tripartite Agreement wasn't a truce between equals. It was the birth certificate of the dollar's supremacy. Then, in 1939, war came. As Germany invaded Poland, the financial architecture of the world shattered. A flood of gold, the ultimate symbol of security, began its desperate journey across the Atlantic. French and British officials, under military escort, shipped their national treasures to the one place they believed was safe: the vaults of the United States. By 1940, the U.S. held over $20 billion in gold, more than any nation in history. The dollar wasn't just strong, it was untouchable. This immense wealth handed President Roosevelt a new kind of power. While the world burned, America could finance its own growth and, through programs like Lend-Lease, supply its allies with ships, planes, and weapons. The price? Gold, and more importantly, future influence. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic carrying bullion wasn't just a transaction. It was a transfer of global power from the old world to the new. By the time America officially entered the war in 1941, the Tripartite Agreement was a distant memory, but its underlying logic was now the law of the land. The dollar had become the de facto world currency, not by design, but by default. Every other major currency had collapsed under the weight of war. When the fighting finally stopped in 1945, Europe was in ruins. Its factories were rubble, its empires bankrupt, its currencies worthless. But one nation stood tall, untouched by the physical destruction and financially stronger than ever: the United States. It had supplied the victors, financed the fight, and now it held almost all the gold. The stage was set for a new world order. In 1944, with the war still raging, leaders from 44 allied nations gathered at a quiet resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to design a new, stable global financial system from the ashes of the old. If the Tripartite Agreement was the quiet rehearsal, Bretton Woods was the grand premiere. On one side was America's Harry Dexter White, the same Treasury official who helped draft the 1936 Pact. On the other, the brilliant British economist John Maynard Keynes, representing a nation on the brink of bankruptcy. They debated for weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The pound had lost its empire. The dollar was there to inherit it. The Bretton Woods system took the framework of the Tripartite Agreement and made it global, formal, and permanent. Currencies would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. Two new powerful institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created to oversee it all. On paper, it looked like a partnership. In reality, it was the dollar standard in disguise. For the next 3 decades, this system was the backbone of the global economy. Every central bank held dollars, every major international transaction was settled in dollars, and it all traced back to that handshake in 1936, when Europe unknowingly passed the financial baton to America. For ordinary people, the Bretton Woods era felt like a golden age. Currencies were stable, inflation was low, and global trade boomed like never before. The American middle class thrived on the strength of its currency. But beneath this calm surface, the old flaw from the Tripartite Agreement was bubbling up again: imbalances. When one currency sits at the center of the world, everyone else is at the mercy of its policies. If America printed more dollars to fund its ambitions, like the Vietnam War, the rest of the world had to absorb the inflation. It was a sweet deal for the U.S., a reality that didn't go unnoticed. France's president, Charles de Gaulle, famously called it America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to buy whatever it wanted simply by running the printing presses. As an act of defiance, he began demanding gold for France's dollar reserves, shipping tons of it back to Paris. It was a bold statement, and for Washington, it was a clear warning sign. By the early 1970s, the system was at a breaking point. The world was flooded with U.S. dollars, far more than the gold sitting in Fort Knox could ever back up. The very promise that made the dollar king, its convertibility to gold, was now an impossible burden. The United States was trapped. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and delivered a bombshell. He announced he was temporarily suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold. That temporary suspension is still in effect today. In that moment, the gold-backed dollar, born from the crisis of the 1930s, was officially dead. But here's the incredible twist. The dollar didn't collapse. Instead, its dominance grew even stronger. Why? Because by then, the dollar wasn't just a currency, it was the entire network. It was a habit the world simply couldn't break. After 1971, the U.S. engineered something even more powerful: the petrodollar system. It struck a deal with oil-producing nations, ensuring that oil, the lifeblood of the modern world, would be priced exclusively in dollars. Suddenly, every country on Earth needed dollars to buy energy, creating a permanent, massive demand for American currency. Global banks recycled these petrodollars into loans, weaving the dollar even deeper into the fabric of international finance. This was the ultimate evolution of the 1936 vision: a world where financial power came not from gold, but from sheer necessity. Today, we talk about dollar dominance as if it started after World War II, but its true origins are older, quieter, and far more accidental. It all began with that obscure Tripartite Agreement in 1936, a desperate pact between three nations that ended up redrawing the map of global power. It taught America a profound lesson. Control doesn't always require armies. Sometimes all it takes is becoming the one thing everyone else depends on. Nearly a century later, we still live in the world that agreement created. But history offers a warning. Every system designed to bring order eventually faces its own chaos. The story of money is never ending. And one day, another quiet pact, in another room, may begin the cycle all over again, redefining the world we live in. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world.